So tonight we'll be hearing from Julia Douglas. Julia Douglas is currently a graduate student at the University of Hawaii at Manoa in the botany department. She is researching conservation strategies and population dynamics of endemic orchids in Oaxaca, Mexico. Julia grew up in Honolulu attending Punahou School, then studied environmental studies at the University of Montana. Before starting graduate school, she worked for a few years in native Hawaiian plant conservation with the National Tropical Botanical Garden on Kauai, the National Environmental Observatory Network in Hilo, and with the Oahu Army National Resource Program on Oahu. Her interests include rare plant conservation, ceramics, surfing, forest reforestation, and long-distance hiking. And tonight she's going to be talking to us about the indigenous uses and conservation strategies of Prosthecia carwinskii. So here's Julia. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Adam. Let me share my screen. Does that look good? Okay. Okay, thank you, Adam, and thank you to the Honolulu Orchid Society for inviting me to speak tonight. So as Adam said, I'm researching the traditional uses and conservation strategies of epiphytic orchids in Oaxaca, and I'm currently a master's student here in the botany department at University of Hawaii. And so specifically, I'm researching the conservation strategies of this single orchid species. This is Prosthecia carwinskii, a beautiful pendant epiphytic orchid endemic to Oaxaca. And it only blooms once a year, and so it blooms at the end of March or early April in Oaxaca and is ephemeral, so it only lasts for a few days. And because of this seasonality of blooming, it has long had a history of cultural use by the people of Oaxaca. And so in addition to its scientific name, Prosthecia carwinskii, there's a number of colloquial names used by the people of Oaxaca. And so La Monjita, or the little nun, Lirio amarillo, or the yellow lily, Itanindeca, which in the Zapotec language means the stuck flower. That word is in Nahuatl, or the Aztec language, meaning the pendant head of the yellow snake, or Flores Santas, and so, or the sacred flowers. And so all of these names represent the importance of this flower to the people of Oaxaca. And so I'm in the ethnobotany lab here in the botany department, and so we're interested in the human uses of plants and the possible consequences of human relationships with plants for both sustainability and for conservation. So how people's relationships or traditional uses of plants can incentivize conservation in some cases, or envisioning conservation strategies that make harvest sustainable. And so in the context of speaking to you guys who are all orchid enthusiasts, and I know many of you have large orchid collections. So when we have many different species in our collections of orchids, maybe you have 50 or 100 species, we don't always have the opportunity to know and understand the stories of those plants. And so by story, I mean its context in an ecosystem and its context culturally. So what does this plant mean to the people in its native area? And so in my research, I'm interested in the story of this plant in Prosthecia carwinskii, or La Monjita. So here it is growing in its native habitat. They grow exclusively, almost exclusively, in the canopy of oak trees underneath the branches. And because this is a seasonally dry habitat, they have engorged pseudobulbs, as you can see there. And that's kind of a strategy to, as you guys know, to allow the plant to persist through long dry periods up to 6 months, and as a storage for water and nutrients. And then you can see in this photo that it just got pollinated and is now, and its seed has just opened. And so a pollinator has never been observed for Prosthecia carwinskii, but it's thought to be a moth. They're beautiful plants. And so to contextualize us or orient us of where this is, here's a map of Mexico, and Oaxaca is in the southeastern state. It's extremely mountainous, going up to 10,000 feet, and very forested with a variety of pine oak forests. And it's in these pine oak kind of composition transitional zones where Las Monjitas grow. And so I was in Oaxaca last year for 4 months throughout the summer, conducting field work and doing research, and I was working mostly in Oaxaca and then in the towns and cities around it. Or not cities, just the towns. And so here's the forest where it grows. These are oak trees of various species. And you can see that there's a lot of Tillandsia osnoides, or what we call Pele's hair here, all up in the canopy of these trees. And so Pele's hair grows kind of associated with these Monjita orchids. And in Mexico, in Oaxaca, they call it pastle or heno blanco as well. Here's more pictures of the forest where these orchids grow. And so they grow in these really diverse epiphyte communities. And so you can see there in the background is one of the Monjitas, and here in the foreground is the Galia species. And then there's also a variety of bromeliads that grow in these canopies, along with a variety of lichens, mosses, and other tillandsias. And they grow more pseudobulbs as they age. So you can see the oldest plants would have up to 40 pseudobulbs. So the oldest plants I saw even had up to 50, and they were 2 feet across. And they produce, 1 or 2 pseudobulbs a year as they're growing during that wet season. And you can see how compact these epiphyte communities are, like how that entire oak branch is totally covered in laelias and other epiphytes. And when I mean epiphyte, I just mean a plant that lives up in the branches of a tree, and so it has no connection to the ground and would never grow terrestrially. And so these environments are very arid. There's no terrestrial water source, and so they depend on atmospheric moisture and are very resourceful in the way that they gather nutrients and survive up in the distal tips even of trees. And so one theory about why this orchid grows pendantly is because there's so many other orchids and epiphytes growing top of the branches that there's no space, and so they evolve to grow downwards as a coping mechanism. That's just one theory. It also could be that the pendant flower is more attractive to pollinators. And so now that gives you kind of an idea for the ecological context for where this orchid grows. And so now we'll kind of move into the cultural context, or how they're used by people in Oaxaca. And so this is Villa de Zachila, the town that I spent a significant amount of time in, redoing interviews with people who are traditional orchid harvesters of the region. And so it's mostly an agricultural town where they grow milpa all around, and milpa is also like the Three Sisters form of indigenous agriculture. And so you can see here the mountains the west of Villa de Zachila are called the Sierra Madre Sur de Mexico of Mexico, and you can see the deforestation on the eastern slope. And so because people have been living in Zachila for so long, they've kind of moved up the slope and have selectively logged or taken trees for charcoal. And so this has impacts on the orchid populations. But you can also see the proximity of Zachila to these orchid populations and to the mountains. And so perhaps this is the reason that the people in this town have developed such rich traditions with these plants. And then on the right, you can see a picture of the, when you're driving into the town, the sign you see that says Corazón de Todos los Zapotecos. Zapotecos are the indigenous group of the area, and this means heart of the Zapotec people. And so this town has a long history of Zapotec tradition, and therefore the celebrations that they enact a long history and deep pre-Columbian roots. And so people, when they think about Mexican culture, often just think of Dia de los Muertos or just Christmas celebrations. But in Zachila, the parties happen all year round, and the different types of celebrations happen almost on a monthly basis throughout the town for the birthday of different virgins, or to acknowledge various saints of different neighborhoods. And these traditions, they enact through dances, through traditional music, through traditional dress. As you can see in this picture was for the Guelaguetza. And there's also Los Zancudos, which are these dancing stiltsmen who dance once a month on certain times of year as a way to commemorate the saints of their neighborhoods. And so I'm showing you these pictures of traditions in Zachila to show you how strong the cultural roots are there. And then to give you a context for Semana Santa, which is one of the most beloved festivals of the year in Zachila. And the key element to the Semana Santa or Easter traditions is this orchid, La Monjita. And so here are some of the churches, which are kind of the center of each neighborhood in Zachila. And they're the ones which are adorned by orchids during the Semana Santa traditions. And so each year on the Sunday, the dawn of the Sunday before Holy Week of Easter, these groups of men called Los Concheros depart the town, traditionally on foot, to retrieve the orchids from the surrounding forest. And so they have these big canasto baskets on their backs, and the idea is that they will go until the basket is full of orchid blossoms, full of monjita blossoms. And so they go, and they've had to go farther and farther afield in recent years as they try to find the orchid populations, which are slowly dwindling. Here are more historic pictures of these men. You can see some of the yellow blossoms that they're collecting, as well as ferns, these big Hupersia species that they've collected. And so then they return that week of Easter and then create these elaborate adornments with thousands of monjita blossoms. And so through my interviews with these concheros, or with these traditional orchid harvesters in this town, it was reported that up to 10,000 blossoms are taken every year, which is a significant number when you realize that this is the reproductive structure of the plant. And so if you cut off the flower, it does not have the opportunity to become pollinated or to set seed. And so therefore has severe repercussions on the reproduction and on the overall population dynamics. And so you can see also how beautiful, and they take a lot of pride in these displays. They also make these elaborate adornments that they then parade through the streets and are a central element of the dances. And so I heard many people in the interviews describe the scent that then fills these churches because there are so many orchid blossoms, and how this scent and the availability and abundance of this particular orchid is really crucial for the overall enactment of this heritage and this festival, which has been going on in this town for thousands of years. Here are more pictures of people adorning their sombreros and their shirts with the blossoms of the flowers, or the flowers. And so this is a quote from a man who grew up in Zachila about the tradition of orchid harvest of this plant. And he says, "The people of Zachila carry in their blood the tradition of the concheros. And although we will never know its origin, we have the obligation to conserve this tradition and transmit it to our descendants." Oops, sorry. "The essence and soul of a town is their customs, their traditions, and their culture. A town without its tradition and its customs is worth nothing." And so you can see from this quote the value that people are placing on this tradition, and that we can't simply just tell people to stop harvesting orchids because the populations are in decline. This cultural element is really important, and unsuccessful orchid conservation efforts in Mexico have simply banned harvest, and that doesn't really work because people have been doing this for hundreds of years, and it's an essential element that needs to be respected and integrated into management plans. So that's what my research is hopefully working towards. And so when I went there last summer, I did a lot of interviews with the concheros, or orchid harvesters of Zachila. So here's a few of them posing with their plants, which they often grow in their courtyards. And so I would sit down with these gentlemen, and we would talk for hours about orchids and what they knew about them, and where you could find the orchids and the importance of them. And so here are some of the quotes and ideas that came out of those interviews. One man said that every time we have to look a little farther to harvest this type of orchid because the environment is changing and now it is harder to find them. Another said, the forest isn't like how it was. And so overall, these people are very observant to changes in the forest, and they've seen changes in wildfire, increased poverty, leading people to harvest more orchids, and so decreasing epiphyte loads. It being more drier, climate change was cited a number of times by these men, in addition to more roads and deforestation. Narco trafficking was also spoken about as a reason that the tradition becomes more complicated to enact. He says that in reality, narco trafficking is ruining the mountains, and now they don't let you go in as easy. And so the people from Zachila are afraid or find difficulty to go to these other areas to enact their traditions and to harvest orchids. Children aren't interested as much as they used to. Orchids are now sold instead of given away. Communities require payment. And so overall, these are all threats to the perpetuation of this biocultural tradition. And so it's important to see that all these threats are kind of combining to potentially erase the tradition of orchid harvest in this town, which would then be a loss to the overall biocultural heritage of both Oaxaca and of Mexico. And so all 12 Conchero participants expressed interest and support for Monjita conservation, and they recognized that something needed to be done, that these populations are in decline, and that something needs to be done to supplement them. And many even identified Santa Ines, a nearby area, as a restoration location. And all of them, it was ubiquitous to express pride and pleasure in being an orchid harvester, that this was who they were, and that it was who their grandfathers were, and who they hoped to teach their kids as well. And that it was, even though it only happens once a year for Easter and Semana Santa, it's an integral part of their identity. And so I created this map from the interviews, and one of the men says, "We go far now because there is nothing nearby. There are no more orchids. Before they were here close." And so you can see these pink dots right to the west of Zachila are the places where they would historically go 50 or 100 years ago. And you can see that now they can't go there anymore because the Monjita populations are depleted, and now they go off to these blue locations to harvest orchids. And so this area right here, these mountains to the west of Zachila, are where I'm proposing with collaborators in Mexico to enact a restoration project. And so just to contextualize the importance of this work, in Mexico, there's 1,300 species approximately of orchids, and 40% of those are endemic, so they exist in Mexico and nowhere else. And of those 1,300 species, over 300 have been cited as wild harvested and utilized by local people. And so that's about a third of the total species count in Mexico, indicating that effective conservation strategies of Mexican orchids really need to respect and integrate traditional uses. And so yeah, as I was saying in the past, unsuccessful attempts have just stopped harvest, and we need kind of a more creative approach. And so you guys might also see some genera that are really common in the horticultural trade: Brassias and Brassivolas and Stanhopias and Laelias. And so kind of this is a series of pieces of information that I like to keep in mind in order to understand the importance of working towards orchid conservation there. In the third bullet, that Prosechia carwinskii is the most traded species in Oaxaca. So a recent market study showed over 50,000 individuals in the illegal trade in the market in Oaxaca. And because of that, as well as because of climate change and deforestation, P. carwinskii populations are in decline, and they're working on putting it on the endangered species list. And so, but simultaneously, the Zachila orchid harvest is part of the biocultural heritage of Oaxaca. So how do we combine both of these elements to come up with a strategy that's effective? So these photos are from the markets in Oaxaca, and you can see the women selling orchids. And generally, the women who sell orchids are from indigenous communities, and they're usually below the poverty line, and they do it for supplemental income. And so it is illegal because it was banned by the Mexican federal government, but rather than this being a truly effective strategy to conserve the orchids, it has just created this huge kind of umbrella of now criminal activity of what used to be just people cutting flowers from their community tenured lands that they owned is now an illegal activity. And so this is not, the federal ban was not quite effective, but you can see the quantity that are being sold in the markets. The yellow ones are the Prosechia carwinskii, and then these are Laelias that are sold around Christmas. And so here's kind of a map of the trade flow pattern. So from the wild epiphyte populations, the pseudobulbs are then harvested. They're either used by churches for these ceremonial ornamentations in Semana Santa, or they're sold in markets. And so then the element that I'm really interested in is how oftentimes after Semana Santa, the pseudobulbs are discarded. And so instead of keeping them, usually people are just discarding as many as 10,000 of these pseudobulbs. But as many of you guys might know, because of your orchid growing activities, pseudobulbs can regenerate, and they can be grown you can grow entire plants and entire populations from a single pseudobulb. And so, my project is then, instead of discarding them, to do a community pseudobulb reintroduction to work to restore an epiphyte depleted forest and resupplement the wild populations. And so here's some interesting pictures of people in Zachila actually already attempting to do this. So many of the people I talked to would save the pseudobulbs after Semana Santa, and they wouldn't put them back in the wild, but they would try to grow them in their houses with quite a bit of success. And so you can see they just strap the bulb right onto a tree, and it would already be producing shoots here. And then they would grow to be entire plants right in the courtyards of people's houses. And so they on a variety of host trees, all the way from limes to mangoes, plastic bottles, and acacia trees. And so this all shows the feasibility of reintroduction, that these pseudobulbs can be grown, they can be successful in a variety of host trees, and potentially could just be returned to the forests from which they were taken. And so I did last summer a series of wild population surveys to understand where in the forest these orchids are growing and why. And so I can, yeah, and so phorophyte means host, so the species of host tree that this orchid is living on. And so I did a series of transects measuring host trees, looking at elevations, slope aspects, abundances, and at presence or absence of other orchids to learn more about this Persechia karwinskii, because very little is known or published about this orchid. There's probably around 10 papers ever published about this species. So here are some maps of us doing transects through the forests there. Here's more lovely plants growing in the wild. These ones have seeds. This is a little juvenile that just got going. And so we would do 500-meter long transects through the forest, mapping where we found the orchids and on which types of host trees. And so the findings were interesting, that they have extreme preferences for certain species of oaks. And so even though all of the oaks in these forests are fairly similar, there's no dramatic difference, there are no visible dramatic differences between the bark or the canopy or the leaves of these oak trees, but the Monjitas almost exclusively grew on Quercus obtusata. And so that's interesting, because here's a picture of all the different host trees lined up in this forest. And it was sometimes very hard, because they would hybridize, to even identify down to species what these oaks were. But the preferences and habitat requirements of these orchids are specific enough that they grow much more abundantly on Quercus obtusata over here on the right. And so this is an important piece of information when moving forward with our restoration plan, because we need to know what type of tree to strap them on in the new restoration site, and where they might have the highest level of success. We also found in the wild population surveys that they predominantly grew in zones 3 and 4 in the canopy. And so that's just kind of these Johansen zones, are just a kind of segment trees. And so to categorize where epiphytes would grow. And so you can see that mostly these orchids are growing about 10 to 15 feet off of the ground in this mid-branch area. And so that will be where we restrap them for maximum success in the reintroduction. And so the second part of the question is, so if we understand that in the Zachila Semana Santa orchid harvest, single pseudobulbs with a single inflorescence are removed from wild plants, reintroduction can only be viable if they can truly regenerate from a single pseudobulb. And so to test this, we did a greenhouse experiment. And so I bought a lot of orchids from the markets. This picture might be kind of interesting, because you guys can see the variety of orchid species that are being sold in the markets by women on the edges of the markets. There's a high diversity. And so they would, you can see the circles, the red circles then show where the Persechia karwinskii are. So I would go and buy these plants. Here are the founder plants, and then I cut them up into single pseudobulbs, kind of simulating a Semana Santa harvest, and then measured new root and shoot growth over 2 months. And so here they are. They're all hanging in the greenhouse, and they only got water once every few days. We really didn't give them much care. And it was extremely successful in the sense that many of them showed the capacity to grow shoots and roots from single pseudobulbs without much care. And so all of these single pseudobulbs, you can see, were quite successful. So 30% of the ones that I cut did show new root growth, and 65% showed new shoot growth. And so all that is exciting as we look to the future. So that's the kind of the work that I did last summer in Oaxaca. And so now I'm planning for the next stage of the restoration in 2021, in which we hope to do an orchid reintroduction. And so strapping them to the trees very similarly to the people, how they do in their courtyards. Orchid reintroductions are done fairly commonly throughout the tropics. Here's a paper that was done in or a project that was done in Brazil in the Atlantic forest, but most commonly that's done with plants that are grown in nurseries and greenhouses, and then they're taken out to the wild and strapped onto the trees to start a new population. And so this project is exciting because instead of having to grow them in the greenhouses, we already have thousands of plants that are utilized in the festivities. And so hopefully the plan is to then collect all of these plants, take them out to the forest of Santa Ines, and then reintroduce them in blocked treatments to understand which ones will be more successful than others. And so this is the proposed suitable but reintroduction in spring 2020 and in 2021 now. This was from last year. In Santa Ines. We were originally planning to do it this year, but it became impossible with COVID to go to Mexico right now. And so now we're looking forward to spring 2021. And so here in the map, you can see Villa de Zachila again, where the Semana Santa festivities are held. And then up here in Santa Ines, where there used to be orchid populations, but no longer. And so there probably used to be orchid populations down here pretty low, where in the place that is now deforested. And so we'll have to go up higher, up to the place where the pine oak forest is still healthy. And so one of the men that I did interviews with, I would ask them if they were interested in participating in the orchid conservation project and where they would like to see orchids again, where perhaps their grandfathers had seen them. And his response was, here no more, here in my town. In Santa Ines, there is a place where these plants were, and now there are none. It is an oak forest. I would like to see more. We wouldn't have to travel. And so I really appreciated these statements of people telling me exactly where they would like to see orchids again. And so throughout the summer in 2019, I worked with the municipal government of Zachila to kind of design the project and to figure out where the plants would go, as well as with the epiphyte lab in the University of Oaxaca. And so it's a collaborative project. And hopefully the idea is that in future years, these people who, the descendants of concheros who once harvested orchids in Santa Ines might see them there again. And instead of it being an endless extraction of orchids from these surrounding forests, that we might shift the cycle slightly. So instead it becomes facilitating stewardship of a managed orchid reintroduction site. So it would become a cycle of harvesting from the site, utilizing them in the Semana Santa festivities, and then returning the monjitas back into the forest. And so that simultaneously the biodiversity of the area could be partly conserved and the traditions of Zachila wouldn't be compromised. As well, the idea that they wouldn't have to travel so far. Some of them right now are having to travel as far as 3 or 4 days by car to find forests where they can harvest orchids. And so the idea that once again they could have orchids in their nearby forest is the hopeful goal in the end. And so kind of going back to the original idea that I am trying to pursue in the research, that this is a complex story behind this plant, and that conservation strategies have to acknowledge this story and understand the context of Oaxaca, the context of cultural harvest, as well as the context of the landscape and where the forests from where this particular orchid is from. And I think, yeah, and I think it's particularly interesting to people who are orchid collectors and orchid appreciators to think about this for every single plant we have. Like, what is the story of this plant? And what's its conservation status? How many are left in the wild? And then potentially too, what is our collective responsibility as orchid enthusiasts to participate in the conservation of these plants so that they may endure in their natural habitat. And I would say that we do have some level of responsibility. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for listening to my talk, and thank you to the universities that have supported me, and to the American Orchid Society, National Geographic, and Society of Economic Botany have all funded the next year of field work in 2021. And so I'm excited to go and hopefully enact the project in the coming year. And muchas gracias are all the people in Oaxaca who helped do the field work, and a huge mahalo to the Honolulu Orchid Society for having me speak today. And I'm super happy to answer any questions about anything that was interesting or unclear.
Why not? Thank you, Julia. I or Jan had a question in the chat. She was wondering, have there been conservation? Has there been conservation education efforts directed to the people of Oaxaca, or specifically in the town there?
What do you mean, like conservation of this plant species?
Or just like education towards conservation of plant species in general, I guess.
Yeah, I think that there is a mentality of conservation in Zachila. Like they do have a Department of Ecology and Environment, and those are the people that I was kind of working with to develop the proposal. And so they do have, they would like to conserve the plants that they harvest. But I think that it, in terms of kind of funding and putting the pieces together to do that effectively hasn't totally happened yet for these 3 plant species that are harvested for the Easter celebrations, but there's definitely enthusiasm and desire to do so, and the educational background to understand that it's necessary.
Julia, I'm interested in the uses of the flower. Because the color is a golden yellow, does it represent any meaning at all to these people, the yellow color of the flower? And then the other thing is that I noticed that they harvested the suitable because the flower itself doesn't last that long. But does the suitable also use as medicine by these people?
Yes, the pseudobulb is used as medicine, and you're right that they only harvest the pseudobulb because the flower will just immediately wilt if it's not attached to the pseudobulb. And so, yeah, people, there have been accounts in different parts of Oaxaca of people using the pseudobulbs medicinally to against diabetes. And there was actually a kind of an ethno-medical trial as well done with the pseudobulbs, and it did show some kind of promising capacity to lessen some of the symptoms of certain conditions or certain aspects of diabetes or inflammation. And people also had used the flowers medicinally. As for the color, I haven't particularly heard any association with the yellow color and that being kind of the key part. Mostly it's people talking about the scent and the aroma that's like the citrony sweet smell of the flower.
Okay. Mel wants to know if there's any pests that need to be concerned about when growing these orchids.
That's something I need to kind of look into. I think, yeah, I'm not certain about which pests are most problematic. In my greenhouse trial that I did, it became apparent that they're just extremely tough. Like we wouldn't really hardly water them. They were just kind of there on wires and they still managed to put out shoots. And they didn't have any pest damage at the time, but they were in the greenhouse, not in the forest. So yeah, I think that pest damage will be something that I have to contend with once we start trying to restore them back into the pine oak areas.
Okay. Tom Miranda is wondering who is doing the red list assessments.
Rodolfo Solano is working on listing them on the NORMA 059, which is like the equivalent of the Endangered Species Act for Mexico. I don't know if he's also working on listing them on the IUCN listing. Yeah. But as of now, they're on the NORMA 059 as kind of like moderately threatened, or I forget like the exact category that they have, but he's looking to move it up to highly threatened or endangered.
Are you associated, or either do you know Dr. Mike Fay from Kew Gardens? Because he is the head of the IUCN for orchid collection.
No, I don't know him.
May I introduce you to him then?
Yeah, sure, that'd be great.
Yeah, you should absolutely contribute to the IUCN with this endangered species. It's good to be in the mainstream on this, and as well as I think it's really, really commendable that you're working with the Mexican government and the Mexican authorities for this, because that truly is the way to go. But you know, the whole idea of red listing is very important for, you know, the world to know the status of all these species. And you're such an expert on this particular species now, it would be really worth your while. And again, in Hilia will help you, so will I. I was also wondering if you managed to get in touch with Rebecca Menchaca. I think I told you about her and her program in Veracruz,
Yeah,
which is similar to yours.
I did contact her, and we kind of were meaning to have a conversation, but I think through COVID weirdness, we never quite linked up. But we're in contact and definitely wanted to kind of get more feedback from each other. I think she's growing the orchids mostly in greenhouses, or that was part of her project. And for this particular species, that no one has really grown them with, I think, huge success on a large scale in greenhouses. Not to say it couldn't be done, but I guess for this particular plant, I think that I don't know if the kind of the cost barrier to creating a greenhouse facility to produce them would be feasible for the towns and people who use them. But that's kind of an interesting balance and conversation for sure.
I was going to suggest to you, I mean, you have this wealth of plant material, since clearly they collect the pseudobulbs, and then you can plant the pseudobulbs in the historic places. It's really absolutely a beautiful project. But I wanted to relate something else to you that has worked in Costa Rica. And they actually have taken the seeds of various native species and mixed them with water, put them in a water gut of like a water pistol, and then they literally spray the seeds onto the branches of the trees. So if you do have access to seed, it would be very interesting, I think, to see if they would germinate in their historic places.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I guess it would also depend on kind of what part of the tree you were spraying them on, which species of tree, and also if the mycorrhizae were already there in the areas. I didn't talk about that in the presentation, but we're hoping to also test for mycorrhizal presence in the restoration sites, or the proposed restoration sites, because without that element, the population will not persist longer than a single generation, and the next generation of plants won't germinate. So yeah.
Have you extracted any mycorrhizae from I guess some of the wild plants? Because we can also connect you to places that are doing the DNA on the various mycorrhizae and also banking mycorrhizae. So if you do need to replenish mycorrhizae in a particular environment, they can create a bank for you.
Oh yeah, that would be great. I have not yet extracted any. We were hoping to, but it was difficult to get permits to bring them out of Mexico, and so hopefully next season I'll be able to kind of work more on that. And yeah, it'd be great to meet anybody or know people who do more of that. Yeah.
I'll connect you. Fabulous. I had one other question that's kind of weird, and that is that many dry forest plants, whether they be cacti or, you know, dry forests in Asia have dendrobiums, and many of them can be mildly psychotropic. And I was wondering if there was any evidence of that with this plant, since it's such an extended dry period. The psychotropism is like a defense mechanism of the plant for being eaten by thirsty animals. Is there any evidence of that?
No, I mean, I don't know. I'm not familiar with that mechanism. But there are, yeah, I mean, I should look into that. And there's also kind of a world of mysteries in terms of understanding how they're coping with severe periods of drought. I've also thought about it in terms of which pseudobulbs might be more successful to reintroduce than others. Like the oldest ones might have a lower capacity to produce new shoots and roots than the newest ones, because some of them are acting as sources and some are acting as sinks as these plants grow and throughout its life cycle. And so I think that understanding the defense mechanisms for drought are an important aspect to understanding how to effectively reintroduce them. Yeah.
Specifically, I was thinking of, I wonder if there's sympatric, there's a Oncidium sebelleta, that's found throughout Mexico that's sometimes used as a substitute for peyote in certain places. So I don't know if it grows in the same region, or I think it's more northern Mexico, but it's something to think about.
Yeah, thank you. I see a question in the chat about genetic diversity. Someone says, can I assume that this species have no major genetic diversity among different populations, thus no major impact in keeping the existing in situ populations as pure as possible when introducing? And so this is a really interesting question and a good question. And the answer is that there is large genetic diversity between the different populations, and this could be a potential problem when reintroducing, because then there'd be genetic contamination. And also when the people go out to harvest the orchids, they're going all over the state of Mexico to all kinds of different populations, and then they're bringing them back to this town and then mixing them. And so when I would receive the pseudobulbs, I would have no idea where they came from. And so I've had some conversations with different orchid people in Mexico about this. And I guess some researchers think that the price of genetic mixing is too much to enact a reintroduction, but I kind of think that if this species is going to go extinct otherwise, that maybe it's worth it to have some of these areas of mixed genetics. And I think the key here is to only reintroduce them in areas where the populations have entirely collapsed. And so we're not going to be putting them into areas where there's existing other Proseccia carwinska areas. We're only going to be putting them into areas where there's absolutely none. And so that the new reintroduced population will be kind of a strange mix of all kinds of genetics from across the state. But I need to continue to think about that and make sure that I don't do any harm by reintroducing things, which is long been a theme of reintroductions of all types of plants and animals. So
Julia, we have a question. How did you come up with this idea? Where did it originate from?
Yeah, well, I have to credit my advisor a lot. Dr. Tamara Tickton is an ethnobotanist here at the University of Hawaii. And so when I came into the program, I was interested in ethnobotany and working with a plant that had cultural significance. And I was also interested in working somewhere in Central America. And so she has been working on doing market studies of orchid use in Mexico. And so she's the one and her students that have been that found that there were 300 species traded and harvested in Mexico. And so she kind of gave me the general concept that this is a need for conservation and that these also have high cultural value. And then I identified this species as an interesting one to pursue because it is the highest harvested in the state of Oaxaca. And then the project also kind of evolved once I got to Oaxaca. I didn't really quite know what I was doing when or quite what the project would be when I first got there. And then once I spent some time in the town of Zachila and started to meet some of the orchid harvesters, it was kind of a process of distilling a meaningful narrative from a complicated series of ecological and local contexts. So, yeah.
Julia, I was wondering, in regards to your project, is there any concern about like viral transfer? Like when putting these plants back or anything? Are there any viruses apparent in this population? Or...
Well, I haven't seen the orchids that are harvested yet because I haven't been there for Easter. I've only seen plants in the wild in a few different sites, and I didn't see any sign of viruses in the plants, but I also wasn't really looking for it. We were just taking down variables about the host trees. Yeah, but I think that is important too in terms of if I introduce them into areas where there's other orchids, like there might not be monjitas or Forsythia karwinskis, but maybe there's laelias or different species there, and I wouldn't want to collapse the other population of orchid by reintroducing these. Once again, I think kind of the solution there is that the restoration sites that we've identified really have no epiphyte populations anymore. They're yeah.
Okay.
I was just going to say that generally speaking, wild orchids don't have viruses. It's something that comes from being
Well, I'm just curious because as part of the tradition, right, they're harvesting these, and potentially in the harvest they could transfer virus with what they're using to cut, right? So that was my concern.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, that's interesting, and I definitely have a lot to learn from you guys and people who are orchid horticulturalists on how to grow them most successfully and how to avoid mortality. Because if I have 10,000 maybe to work with after the Easter celebrations, one of the main goals will be to make sure that there's a high survivorship. That it'd be great if 8,000 survived or 5,000 survived. Like the highest number would be better, and so good horticultural practices will be important.
And then also, how will you guard your efforts from like illegal plant trade activities? Is there any?
That's a really interesting question, and that's kind of a big problem or a big ongoing question about whether or not when we reintroduce the orchids into this forest, if people from around the area will go in to then cut them and sell them for supplemental income. And so when I was there, I would go to the community land authorities of these different proposed restoration sites. And first I had to ask permission to be there and ask permission to enact the project. And then we discussed that a little bit. And from what I was told by the land managers in this one proposed restoration area, is that if I work with them and they kind of introduce many of people of the area to the idea of this being a restoration site and that illegal harvest would be discouraged. I think that, or they thought that people would not harvest from the area. And I think that there's a growing awareness, especially in these mountain towns, of the value of biodiversity and how that might, and there's a growing number of kind of ecotourism ventures as well in these mountainous areas that bring also supplemental income into the communities. And so I think that increased education would be effective to prevent some so kind of bad stories about maybe a group of people who live in a town and have long harvested kind of in a somewhat sustainable way their orchid population to sell in the local market. And then I heard one story about them going one day to their orchid population and every single wild orchid had been taken by people from a different area who came in and just took everything to sell it. And so, yeah, this is a issue on a larger scale than just my project.
Mm-hmm. And then are the forests that these orchids are growing in, are they protected at all?
What, no, or where the orchids are growing or where we're proposing to reintroduce them?
I guess both.
You know, they're not really protected forests. They're under community tenure, and so the kind of indigenous groups of the different mountain towns own the land and have autonomy to manage it the way they see fit. And so they're not it's not officially under conservation protections, but it could be, or they could make regulations to protect it if they would like to. Yeah.
Yeah. And then Eddie asks, on a social level, how did the Oaxaca local population view your efforts and while being of an image of a stereotypical American? His visits to Chiapas in the past with his Malaysian students, there was no initial issues until the natives addressed them in Spanish.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a balance I've thought a lot about kind of the balance between pushing a project versus facilitating it, and making sure that I am more facilitating a project that people there are excited about rather than pushing a conservation or development project, which is a model of international development that I wouldn't want to ascribe to. And so I think that my interviews with people really reinforced my idea and understanding that people there are excited about orchid conservation. And if I could just kind of bring in some funding and bring in some enthusiasm, then they would also participate, and that beyond that, that they would continue the project beyond myself. Like even if I'm not there in 10 years, that people they would continue to replant the orchids. On a social level, people there were really open to me, and obviously I'm not from Oaxaca, and this is their tradition and not mine. And everything that they share with me is an act of generosity, and I appreciate that. But yeah, I was treated extremely well by the people there, and I think that continued humility and respect when interacting is kind of the approach that I hope to take.
Julia, can we ask you to please clone yourself and put yourself in every community where orchids grow on Earth, because we need a lot more people like you on this planet.
Thank you.
Well, are there any other questions for Julia? I think the work you're doing is fascinating and a really good example of what is possible. You took a great example that has a lot of history, a lot of cultural significance. Things are going on in the area, and you're working with the group that is there and using the orchids, applying scientific conservation techniques to that. We would like to hear how things go in the future after you have more data collected about how successful the program would be. So we'd like to continue keeping in contact with you and hearing more about your work.
Yeah, thank you. I would love to come back kind of after I'm able to go, and hopefully next spring, and enact the first stage. I would love to come back and share more with you guys about what happens. Yeah.
Okay, well, the AOS is expecting something from you as well. And maybe you might consider doing a webinar for the AOS as well. It's really fantastic here.
Thanks, yeah. Yeah, and it's exciting to talk to the Orchid Society. I came to a few meetings last year before the shutdown, and it was always great to participate and always great to talk to other people that are excited about growing plants and growing orchids.
Adam, do you have any other questions for Julia?
Not from other people, but I might have some. What in your experiment with the individual pseudobulbs that you rooted, did you end up finishing that? Like you planted them out, or?
No, so last that I heard, we had grown them for 3 months, just individually hanging on wire, and then the ones that had produced shoots and roots, we then put on oak trunks that I had gotten in the firewood market, and so then from there I then donated them to the botanical garden that's just kind of slightly south of Oaxaca. And the woman there was going to kind of take care of them and see if they really took off and produced nice big plants. And I kind of haven't, or I kind of fell out of contact with her with COVID in Oaxaca, which has kind of hit quite hard. And it's been really hard for the town of Xochitl, which has had, I think, a few hundred cases at this point, which is really hard for a small rural town. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I don't know what happened to the plants at this point, and I'm really hoping that the town kind of pulls through. Yeah, one other interesting element is that they canceled all of the conchero activities because that was right at the end of March and in early April of this year, and so that was the first time that they had canceled the conchero activities and told the orchid harvesters they couldn't go on this pilgrimage to harvest the orchids for hundreds of years. And so I talked to one of the orchid harvesters on the phone, and I mean, they were all very disappointed, but it was interesting also to see kind of how flexible and resilient they were. They weren't saying like, oh, this is it, we're never going again. They were saying, you know, we absolutely will go again next year, and we have to be flexible with our traditions if we want them to persist.
Right on. I think that's all the questions I had.
So Julia, I had a question regarding what length of time are you going to do the follow-up? Once you do the reintroduction of the plants into those areas that had very few plants to begin with at the current, what period of time are you going to let them grow before you go back and check them?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm hoping to be there for the first 3 months, and so kind of seeing how they do initially, because I'm expecting kind of high mortality in that first few month period, and was even hoping to kind of water them a little bit and kind of help them along the way to get them established, and then hopefully monitoring them on a yearly basis. And I mean, it would be great to do this for the next like 50 years. Like I would be super excited to go back every year for 50 years and see how they do, and each year add more and more and help in whatever way I can. I'm in the process of trying to transition from a master's to a PhD, and so that would at least facilitate 5 years or 4 years of monitoring. And I'm hoping that within 4 years, enough variation in success and survivorship would be apparent for something interesting to be said about it. So at least 4 years, yeah.
And then when you do the replanting, what is the natural rain like at that time?
Oh yeah, that's a good question too. And so, so since they're harvested at Semana Santa, that's right at the very end of the dry period. And usually the monsoon rains come to Oaxaca at the end of May and early June. And so I think kind of the idea would be even to cultivate them in the greenhouse, the pseudobulbs, for maybe a month or two, and then put them out just as the rainy season comes. And so that they would be getting some water for those first 3 months as they kind of establish some roots. And then hopefully they make it through the first dry period of 6 months come September, October. But then climate change is also, of course, an issue. And so we were hoping also to reintroduce them in blocked treatments at different elevations. And so that maybe kind of do something that would be like almost a simulated migration, you know, like helping them move up elevations as they need more precipitation and slightly different temperatures with changing climate.
I just think it's really interesting how this project for this one species has delved into so many aspects of plant conservation. And he's talking about assisted migration and mycorrhizae, and it's just really fabulous how it's all integrated in this particular species.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm excited about it. Yeah. And eventually, another idea that I'm excited about too, my advisor and I are trying to write another grant to get enough to support a few other grad students on the same project from the University of Mexico. And so having a few people from the UNAM, the University in Mexico City, to also be able to do their master's or doctorates on the same project, because there's plenty to do. Yeah.
Great.
I wonder, Julia, do you also do the chemical analysis, since you mentioned it's medicinal and it might be useful for diabetes and all? Do you do some chemical constituent analysis?
No, I haven't done that yet. That hasn't really been a part of it. I kind of focus on the ecological side of it for now, but that would be great to do. There's that one paper done on the diabetes effects or the diabetes symptoms, and then there was actually some other interesting work done with the scent of the volatile compounds in the scent by perfume companies, because they were interested in using it in perfumes. But yeah, I haven't done that, or I don't know too much about it. So.
And I like to see that color yellow, very, very intense yellow color, is containing zeatin, which is really good for our eyes, especially people with glaucoma. So it will be very interesting if you have a chance to analyze that.
Yeah.
The color pigment in there.
Yeah, I'll add that to my list.
Julia, I just thought of a question. What elevation is the town, and what elevation are the plants found in the mountains?
Yeah, the town is at about 1,000 meters or 3,000 feet, and then the mountains go up from there. And so the orchid populations start around 2,500 meters up to 26 or 27. And so it's in meters there. So I guess that's like less than 10,000. So like between 6 to 8 or 9,000 feet. And then there's variation. So in different areas, like in La Mixteca, which is like a part of Oaxaca to the west, they're at lower elevations because it's a little bit colder there. Yeah.
Okay, that's good. This Prostechia kowinskii, is that Prostechia citrina? Are they synonyms?
No, so that's another interesting question. Citrina and Karwinskii are only really distinguishable when they flower, and so citrina has more of an open petals, and the labellum is not, or there's differences in the labellum as well, and you can't tell them apart just vegetatively. And so one element is that the concheros, the orchid harvesters, are probably harvesting both species when they go out because they're not going to differentiate between the two. And so therefore the mix that we would receive in the town after Semana Santa is potentially 2 species of orchid. And sometimes these have been split and lumped during different time periods. And it's also possible that they hybridize. And so I haven't really come up with a solution yet of how to deal with the fact that there might be 2 species of orchid. And yeah, we haven't come, I mean, I guess going back to my original comment about the genetics, that I think that at least maybe a hybrid swarm population would be better than nothing as a restoration effort.
Okay. Another question is, at that elevation, in the dry season, sometimes it doesn't rain for months, but is there morning dew present at that elevation, the 2,000 to 3,000 feet?
Yeah, there is morning dew from what I remember when I was there. And there's also a lot of fog inception that happens with the oak trees. And so there's kind of this, yeah, kind of like atmospheric precipitation that would probably occur. And in Oaxaca, above 8,000 feet, up to 10,000 feet, there's also cloud forests that do have kind of atmospheric fog moisture all year round. And these orchids don't grow really in the true cloud forest. They're a little bit lower elevation, but yeah, they also are probably dependent, like you're saying, on a little bit of fog and dew.
Oh, that's interesting.
I'm curious if the oak trees defoliate at all, or are they at all deciduous in the dry season?
Oh yeah, that's an important part too. They're all deciduous, and so they all defoliate at some part of the year. But because they're different species of oaks, they're on different schedules of when they defoliate. And so when we're looking at which host oaks are preferred by the orchid over others, their seasonality of when they lose their leaves probably has a big effect on that, because that impacts how much light and precipitation and nutrient content of the leaves that they're receiving. And it's also interesting that, so yeah, the time period that these orchids blossom in late April or early April is before most of the oaks get all of their leaves in the monsoon season. So this is a time where there is no leaves. It's like, so the canopies are really open. And so it's interesting that that's when they bloom, potentially, so that the pollinators could more easily see the flowers or more easily smell them or find them in the forest. And so I'm excited to see them when they blossom. It's supposed to be incredibly beautiful because it's these kind of skeletal trees with these beautiful yellow flowers everywhere.
Have you considered putting up a sort of a camera trap to see if indeed it is a moth that pollinates it?
Yeah, I should do that too. Yeah.
I want to come and do it.
Yeah, you could do that. That'd be great.
Awesome.
Weren't you saying that the orchid harvesters like follow their nose to the plants and stuff?
Yeah, I guess I didn't mention that here, but yeah, I mean, some of the interviews they described how they would find the orchids in the forest was that they would smell them before they would see them, and so they would follow the scent of the orchids through the mountains, which is really beautiful. Yeah. Another interesting concept on that same front is that it was told to me by the orchid harvesters that the scent of the orchids that they grow in their houses and on the trees in their courtyards is much different and much less intense than the orchids in the wild. And so the reasons for this, I don't quite know at this time, but they all kind of consistently said that the ones in the wild smell much more strongly than the ones that they grow in their houses. And so for this reason, wild orchids would be preferred than the ones that they had grown. Yeah, for the adornments.
I think Encyclia citrina has a much wider range than Carlishtii, which you're saying is endemic to Oaxaca. I'm wondering if other communities are harvesting citrinas at an even greater rate.
Yeah, potentially. I think so. I mean, I've only worked in this one town, and so I can't speak for other towns, but it's such a beautiful flower that I'm sure it's harvested in large quantities, and yeah.
Well, hopefully your efforts will spread all around Mexico.
Okay, thank you, Julia. It was a wonderful presentation. We learned a lot.